Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With Brexit dominating the news every other day and the March 29th deadline in sight, we thought it was a good opportunity to catch up with Teagasc expert Kevin Hanrahan to talk through the various outcomes and how it will affect Irish agriculture, with particular emphasis on the dairy sector. And I started by asking Kevin where the Brexit process currently stands.
The Brexit process is stuck. Sometimes it's described as an impasse. So the 27 member states, other than the European Union, than the UK, have agreed a withdrawal agreement with the UK, and they are proceeding to ratify it. But the problem is that the UK, at least from my perspective, hasn't yet decided what it wants in terms of an end outcome to Brexit, what type of Brexit it wants, and it has yet it's failed to make any progress on getting that withdrawal agreement that they signed with the rest of the European Union agreed in the House of Commons. And there's been a series of votes that people have heard about on the news that have sort of indicated that the House of Commons wants the British government to go back and open up negotiations with the EU 27. And so far, the European Union 27 have said that they've had almost 2 years of negotiations, and this is as good a deal as they can get with the UK, given the UK's so-called red lines, which have effectively, right from the start, clearly limited the zone of possible agreement between the EU 27 and the UK that's now leaving the European Union to what's in the withdrawal agreement. And so it's hard to see where we go from here until we have some movement on either the UK red lines or the European Union's position that it's unwilling to undermine the single market and is unwilling to basically compromise on the need for a backstop.
And then if we look then at the 29th of March, and look, it's a date that's fast approaching, you know, what are the potential outcomes that will be achieved on that date?
Anyone tells you that they know what's going to happen is really doesn't know what they're talking about, unfortunately. It's possible that the UK will crash out and that they will leave the European Union without having agreed a withdrawal agreement, and that the European Union will have to treat the UK as what's called a third country, just like any other country, basically, not like a member of the European Union, which it obviously isn't once it's left, and not like a country with which it has a trade agreement, which if the UK goes out in any way other than under a withdrawal agreement, it won't have a trade agreement with the European Union. And if that happens, the European Union, and Ireland as a member of the European Union, will have to impose taxes on imports of goods. Those taxes are called tariffs. And because the UK won't be in the single market, it would also have to do very detailed checks on all goods, but the checks that are done on agricultural and food products are much more detailed because of the fact that this is stuff that we eat or is traded in goods, animals that ultimately we consume as food. So there will be very stringent regulatory checks on trade between the UK and the European Union, and also these taxes, these tariffs. And we don't yet know what the UK will do in that world where it crashes out. It will inherit the European Union sort of list of taxes, because it will now be a WTO member in its own right, and it will have a schedule, like a list of tariffs that in theory will be equal to the European Union ones, but we don't know whether they will apply those or whether they will apply taxes that are lower than those. If they apply the EU levels of tariffs, most of the key commodities, agricultural commodities that we currently export to the UK will not be competitive on the UK market after paying taxes, after taxes are levied on them. And those exports will quickly go from very, very significant to very, very insignificant, because our products just won't be competitive. If, on the other hand, the UK decides to reduce the taxes from the European Union style levels that it applies to imports of agricultural commodities like butter or beef, Under the WTO rules, there's a principle called most favored nation principle, or MFN. And what that basically means is that the UK, as a WTO member, has to treat all other WTO members equally. So if it reduces the tariffs on trade between the UK and the European Union, it wants to be able to import beef or butter or other commodities onto the UK market. It has to reduce them for all WTO members. So what that means is that the preferential access that Ireland currently enjoys on the UK market, because the UK is a member of the European Union, would go, and we would be competing on the UK market with products from outside the European Union. And depending on the commodity, our costs of production are either ones that are as competitive as our international competitors, and that's the case for many dairy commodities. But particularly for beef, our costs of production are significantly higher than those of some of our world market competitors. And in a world where we were not facing any tariffs going into the UK, but we're competing with Brazilian or Argentinian beef, our exports to that market would decline almost certainly. So it's not a good picture, I'm afraid, if the UK crashes out. The alternative is that somehow or other between now and the end of March, we either get a withdrawal agreement, or we get the UK applying for an extension to the Article 50 time clock, basically, so as to allow more time to try get a withdrawal agreement. If in the end of the day, either at the end of March or in June or at some later point, we get a withdrawal agreement, well, with withdrawal agreement, we get a 2-year transition period where everything more or less stays the same in terms of the rules that govern trade between the UK and the European Union. And during that 2 years, the European Union and this country called the United Kingdom, that is now no longer in the European Union, would basically be working very hard to get a trade agreement agreed. And the political declaration between the European Union and the UK that goes along with the draft withdrawal agreement kind of sets the scene for what could be possible, and there's a whole spectrum of potential end outcomes, from ones where the trade agreement is not one that leaves us as close as possible to where we currently are, to which is like a Norway style agreement, to alternatives where such as like a Canadian model where there would be very few tariffs between the UK and the European Union market, but where there would be significant regulatory barriers because the UK would be choosing not to be in the single market. So, and on the basis of the UK red lines at the moment, they don't want to be in the single market, and in essence, essentially, they don't want to be in the customs union either, because they want to be able to pursue their own independent international trade policy, which you can't really do if you're in a customs union with the European Union. But the only way we get to a future trade agreement with the UK that will mitigate the impact of Brexit on Irish agriculture is if we get a withdrawal agreement. And that's where people need to be looking at is where are we going to get a withdrawal agreement, or are we going to get a delay in the whole process so as to try to get a withdrawal agreement, or are UK politicians willing to basically roll the UK out of the European Union without any withdrawal agreement? And if that occurs, there will be major economic pain right across the economy in the UK particularly, and the member states of the European Union that's most likely to be most affected after the UK is Ireland, unfortunately.
And if we take a look at that, Kevin, if we look at the crash out scenario, what sort of impacts will that have on the various Irish agricultural sectors?
Well, we've done some work for the Department of Agriculture that hasn't been released yet, but the Minister for Agriculture has written articles in the press about it. So I'm not breaking any secrets. You're talking about very significant reductions in the prices of the carcass price of beef in Ireland, and by significant I mean 20% by 10 years' time on the assumption that that the UK crashes out and there's no deal made, and there's no action by the European Union to mitigate the impacts on the market. Milk prices wouldn't go down by as much, but would decline relative to where they would go in a world where Brexit wasn't happening. So they would be down, but by less than 10%. They would decline relative to a world where we weren't looking at Brexit. But it's important when people sit with their ear pods in their ears and they're at work or they're driving somewhere, that they need to understand that when economists like myself talk about these scenario impacts, we are assuming that there's no political response to that outcome, and almost certainly there will be a political response from the Irish government and from the European Union to that shock. So in previous kind of political crises that have affected agricultural market prices, the European Union has shown itself willing to intervene and to support prices to at least a limited extent. So when the Russian embargo was introduced, countries at the eastern side of Europe that had lots of trade with Russia, namely Finland and the Baltic states and Poland, there were policy responses to the impact of the Russian embargo on agricultural markets. Now, the problem is that if Brexit is forever, the willingness of the European Union to basically come in and either support market prices or to support farm incomes because of the negative impact of the shock on market prices on those incomes in perpetuity is or forever is low. They're not going to be willing to do that. But what they have shown themselves willing to do is to provide short-term support, and there are instruments within the European budget on a bigger scale where they have provided assistance to industries that are affected by trade shocks to adjust. Now, usually when you hear an economist talking about assistance in terms of adjustment, what it means really is giving people money or resources to change what they're doing, so they're no longer a factory worker in Dell because the globalization has led to the factory closing and they have to retrain to get another job. How that will work in the agricultural sector, particularly given that farmers who have large land assets and non-land assets invested in their farms, who all of a sudden find themselves, out of business or losing a lot of money because of a political decision that they had nothing to do with. How they are assisted to adjust to that type of shock is very difficult to see in the medium to longer term. So the response will be a mixture of short-term assistance to stabilize markets, perhaps longer-term assistance to enable people to adjust perhaps to different types of farm enterprises, or to change their the amount of time they spend working in farm and off farm, so as to basically allow them to have a better paying job off the farm, perhaps. But it will also be probably assistance in terms of helping Ireland and the Irish agri-food sector find markets or to develop markets that could begin to replace the UK market. But the UK market is so large that it's hard to see overnight how you could find any market, certainly within the European Union or globally, that could just come in and just seamlessly replace the UK, because the UK is so big for Ireland. So it'll be the new markets, new products piece will take a much longer time to develop and to succeed at. But it's what Teagasc Food Research and the extra resources that are going to that is aimed at. It's why Board Bia is getting more resources from the government to increase its network in non-EU markets, so that we can start to work harder at getting Irish products onto shelves that they currently have. To date, they haven't been on, or have only been on to a limited extent. Basically, to start to try and across a whole set of smaller markets to create extra opportunities that could cumulatively begin to substitute for the large UK market. Now, the UK market is right beside us. So I think there, which even in a world where they crash out, there probably will still be exports of agricultural goods to the UK. It's just that if they choose to impose tariffs on the trade with the European Union, or if they choose to unilaterally liberalize their tariffs, we will not be able to ship the kind of volumes that we have traditionally shipped to the UK, and that's a different world we'll have to face into.
And I suppose, look, you've highlighted the impact on, say, product price, and but if we, you mentioned the EU. If we take a look at, say, the EU payments received by Irish farmers, is that going to be affected by I suppose, any Brexit outcomes?
So the budget for Ireland coming from the CAP is going to get smaller in this next budget period as compared to this one, but it's partly it's due to Brexit, but I would have expected, even in the absence of Brexit, that budget allocation to the CAP and to Ireland from the CAP would have gotten smaller, because the European Union wants to, people are asking it to address new challenges outside of agriculture, like immigration, security, climate change. And the Common Agricultural Policy at the moment absorbs about 40% of all the European Union budget. So if we want to spend more money on climate change or on security or on immigration, we have to find the money somewhere, because the member states of the European Union, to date at least, have been unwilling to put more money into the pot, into the European budget pot. So if we want to spend more money on this or that, generally speaking, in the European context, some at least of that extra money has to come from the agriculture budget, because it's such a large chunk of what we spend the money on. So I would have expected, even in the absence of Brexit, for the CAP budget to have gotten a little bit smaller. The only wrinkle in all that is that because we are unlikely to get an agreement in CAP reform by the end of April, it'll be basically put on pause, and it'll have to be done by the next European Parliament and the next College of European Commissioners. And the budget will run out. And what will happen in the absence of a political agreement on a new CAP is that we will roll over the new CAP, so the same rules will apply. But we will have a budget that will not have the UK in it if the UK leave, for example, with no deal. So it's possible in that eventuality that there would be a negative impact on the value of direct payments. But if we get a new CAP agreed, the negative impact of the UK leaving is not as large as we might have imagined it would have been maybe a year or two ago, when we thought that Brexit would, because they were a big net contributor to the budget, would have left us maybe 10% down on where we would have been in the absence of Brexit. And I don't think the impact would be quite so large, but we might have a short-run problem if we don't get a CAP reform agreement and we don't have an agreement on a new EU budget. So it's complicated, unfortunately. So there's a potential for some pain.
And if we just turn our attention, Kevin, to the dairy sector, and the dairy sector has a lower reliance on the UK for its exports, I suppose, in comparison with the beef. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that is fair. Yeah. It's fair. It is fair, but certain product categories have a very heavy reliance on the UK market. So depending on who you're, as a farmer, who you're supplying your milk to, if your co-op or dairy processor is using your milk to make lots of cheddar cheese, then it's got a much higher exposure to the UK market than if your co-op is not basically a big maker of cheddar cheese. So it does depend. But on average, across in terms of the uses of Irish milk, if you think about the Irish dairy sector as just a big entity, it has a much lower dependence on the UK market than the beef market. And most importantly, it is also competitive for some of its products on the world market. So which is not the case really for the Irish beef industry. So, and also the vision of the industry, of the dairy industry, is obviously to continue to grow its milk output and to continue to grow the output of the products it processes out of that milk. And the markets that the dairy industry sees as taking that extra production isn't really the European Union. It's beyond the European Union. So that reflects the fact that they are that it is globally competitive, and because of that status, it at least has the ambition and the capacity to adjust its offering away from the UK, because if it faces tariffs, and towards other places that it can still be profitable in supplying. And unfortunately, that's not the case for the beef industry. But there is, so the dairy industry will almost certainly come through Brexit. It will lower milk prices, but it won't lower them to the extent that at the margin dairy farmers are unprofitable.
And you mentioned a lot of the products. For example, I mean, the simple one is cheddar cheese that's being processed essentially and marketed in the UK. You know, how does it practically work? You know, we have a lot of co-ops, I suppose, dealing across border with Northern Ireland with raw milk. What's the solution for, I suppose, that enterprise?
Well, I think the solution partly is many of those co-ops who are shipping milk north to south, and sometimes south to north. Most of those co-ops have kind of processing facilities on both sides of the border. And in the event of a hard Brexit, where there's no backstop and so on, it's hard to see how those flows of milk in trucks for processing, moving back and forward, will be allowed to continue. I just don't see how that's going to be allowed. But there may be, you know, we have a number of Irish, Southern Irish, or based or headquartered dairy processing companies that you can imagine could cooperate with one another, so that the milk that Lakelands was taking down or sending north could be used by Arrivo or Patrick, and they could basically reorganize their flows of milk to try to keep the throughput in their individual factories as close as possible to where it was before Brexit, but adjusting to the fact that they just can't drive a truck full of milk across the border for processing, either north-south or south-north, because your ability as a Republic of Ireland based producer to put that IE stamp on your butter or your cheese or whatever dairy commodity happens to be would be in question if it was based on milk that was not from the European Union. And in the event of a hard Brexit, the milk that you import from Northern Ireland to make that product would not be European Union milk. So you wouldn't be legally, there would be some legal doubt as to whether you can market your dairy commodities with that IE stamp. So it will be particularly for those cooperatives who are the farmers whose milk is being collected and taken across the border. That's no one ever thought would be important. That will not be allowed to happen. Basically, as far as I understand the situation now, this is going to be a much bigger problem for dairy farmers in the north of Ireland than it is going to be for dairy farmers in the south. And some of the dairy processors in the north have been criticised by British politicians for, well, why haven't they just spent hundreds of millions of pounds building new plants to process the milk that won't be able to go to the south? Won't they have a great market in the UK once their southern neighbours aren't allowed to export to the UK because of tariffs or whatever? And the leaders of those industries, those firms, have been very, very quick to come back and say, well, we still don't know whether or not there's going to be any of those barriers. I mean, if we have a withdrawal agreement and if we have a deep and comprehensive trade agreement, we might be still able to trade north and south and east and west without any barriers. So why would we spend money we don't yet know we have to spend? So there's still not the processing capacity in Northern Ireland for all the milk they produce. And in the event that they can't send it south to be processed, they're going to be in a very hard place. They're going to have to start to roll milk trucks onto ferries and get it across to Scotland to get processed. And that does not sound like a good idea to me in terms of actually keeping it fresh again and being able to. The milk will not be, the standards would not possibly be it might be. I'm not a dairy scientist, but I can imagine that there would be problems in the type of products you want to make with that milk if it's been sitting in a truck waiting to get onto a ferry or get off a ferry for a long time.
And I suppose finally, Kevin, just to wrap up, like you've mentioned a lot of the, I suppose, short, medium and long-term supports that I suppose our own government and the EU are looking at to support farmers, I suppose, through this process. But I suppose looking at individual farmers in Ireland, is there anything they can do themselves to try and insulate themselves from low farm incomes resulting from Brexit?
My principal advice is that unfortunately farmers are the classic price takers. So there's not an awful lot they can do about what the British decide, right? So that's beyond their control. And there's currently huge amounts of uncertainty as to what the outcome will be still. So it's still a very smoky battlefield. So the best thing I think farmers can do is, if they are about to make a big lumpy investment, is to wait a little bit, and if they can, to see whether or not a world where prices were lower is one where they'd still want to make that investment. So I think, if the farmers are considering making a big investment, and if their business plan is based around, does not have the kind of the capacity within it to basically still be a profitable proposition at a milk price that's a good few cents lower, they need to perhaps just stop a little bit and think about it and wait for more clarity to come in on what will be the market relationship between the UK and the European Union on a medium to longer term basis. Because I would not like to see people taking out massive big loans that would basically not be repayable in the event of a Brexit. That's very bad from the perspective of the ag sector. So I think given that we will have some clarity, we hope in the next 3 to 6 to 9 months at the very latest on where we're going, I think farmers might be well advised just to sit tight for a little bit and see how the mist and the smoke clears and what the lie of the land is.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, Emily's.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Kevin Hanrahan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.